5 times, Sarah Chen has been rejected as a mail-order bride in Wyoming territory. 5 times she's been sent back to San Francisco with the same harsh words, "Too quiet." In 1885, being quiet isn't just a personality trait, it's a sentence to loneliness. No one seems to understand that her silence holds depth, her gentle gestures carry meaning, and her written words tell stories richer than speech. Then she meets James McAllister. As a deaf rancher, he's lived his entire life in a world where words are seen, not heard, where feelings are read in expressions, not voices, where the loudest hearts often beat in the quietest souls. What if the very thing that made Sarah unwantable to others made her perfect in his eyes? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The train whistle pierced the foggy San Francisco morning as Sarah Chen clutched her leather journal closer to her chest. 5 rejections, 5 return journeys, each one carved deeper into her spirit than the last. She watched porters unload her single trunk, the same one she'd packed with such hope just 3 weeks ago. Mrs. Sullivan from the Golden Gate Marriage Agency stood waiting on the platform, her face a mixture of sympathy and resignation. The woman's grey hair was pulled back severely, matching her stern expression. She'd been arranging marriages for Chinese brides for 15 years, and Sarah knew she'd never had one returned so many times. "Perhaps," Mrs. Sullivan said, helping Sarah with her trunk. "It's time to consider other options, dear." Sarah's fingers tightened around her journal. Inside its pages lay her true voice, elegant Chinese calligraphy mixed with carefully practiced English, expressing thoughts she could never seem to speak aloud. She'd filled 3 such journals since leaving China 4 years ago, each page a testament to everything she couldn't say. "Mr. Patterson wrote that you barely spoke 2 words at dinner," Mrs. Sullivan continued as they walked toward her office. "He said his ranch needs a wife who can manage social calls, direct farm hands, negotiate with merchants." Sarah nodded, remembering the growing frustration in Mr. Patterson's eyes each time she'd hesitated to speak. How could she explain that in China her silence had been considered graceful, respectful, that her mother had taught her the power of careful words, of watching and learning before speaking? The marriage agency office smelled of leather and paper. Sarah settled into the familiar chair across from Mrs. Sullivan's desk, where she'd sat so many times before. 5 rejection letters lay spread between them, each one marked "Return to Sender" in angry red ink. "You're a beautiful girl, Sarah. Well-educated from a good family. But America," Mrs. Sullivan paused, searching for gentle words. "America requires a different kind of woman. Perhaps you'd be happier returning to China, finding a husband among your own people." Sarah opened her journal, turning to the page where she'd practiced this conversation in both languages. Her careful handwriting stood in stark contrast to the trembling in her hands as she pushed the paper across the desk. "I cannot return to China," she'd written. "My family sacrificed everything to send me here. I will try again. Please, Mrs." Sullivan read the note, then looked up at Sarah's face. Something in the young woman's steady gaze made her pause. "You truly won't give up, will you?" Sarah shook her head. She pulled out another piece of paper, this one covered in detailed drawings of the Wyoming landscape she'd seen from the train windows. Mountains stretched across the page, clouds gathering above vast prairies. In the margins, she'd written descriptions in perfectly formed letters. "Land of big sky, place where silence speaks." Mrs. Sullivan studied the drawing, then smiled slightly. "There is one more possibility. A rancher near Laramie, James McAllister. He's requested a bride several times, but..." She hesitated. "Well, he has his own unique circumstances. Would you be willing to try once more?" Sarah nodded without hesitation. One more chance, one more journey. Her fingers traced the edges of her journal, where blank pages waited to be, filled with whatever story came next. "Very well," Mrs. Sullivan said, pulling out a fresh contract. "But Sarah, this must be the last time." For both our sakes. As Mrs. Sullivan prepared the paperwork, Sarah opened her journal to a new page. At the top, she carefully wrote the date, then added in her flowing script, "6th journey, final chance, the mountains are calling again." Outside the office window, fog rolled back from San Francisco Bay, revealing glimpses of blue sky. Somewhere, far to the east, beyond the Sierra Nevada and the vast plains, Wyoming waited. Sarah didn't know it yet. But this time, fate had something different in store. A man who would understand her silence in ways she couldn't imagine, and a love that would teach them both new ways to speak. James McAllister sat on his usual bench at the Laramie train station, his leather-bound sketchbook open across his knees. Though he couldn't hear the approaching train, he felt its vibrations through the wooden planks beneath his feet. His pencil moved across the page, capturing the scene before him, passengers emerging from the morning mist, their faces telling stories his ears would never know. 20 years of silence had taught him to see what others merely heard, the way a mother's hands tightened on her children's shoulders when worried, how a man's jaw clenched before speaking harsh words, the subtle shift in posture that meant someone was about to turn and walk away. The station master, Henry, touched his shoulder, their signal that he had a delivery. James nodded, tucking his sketchbook into his coat. The ranch needed supplies, and the weekly train brought everything from seed to sugar. He'd learned long ago to time his supply runs with the passenger train. It was easier to conduct business. When everyone was distracted by new arrivals, his fingers brushed the rough texture of his sketchbook as he stood. Inside, hundreds of faces told the story of Laramie through his eyes. The baker's daughter, growing from child to woman. The sheriff's deepening worry lines during last year's drought. The changing fashions of strangers passing through. His art spoke what his voice couldn't, telling stories through careful observation and delicate shading. Henry gestured toward the supply cart, but James's attention caught on something else. A young woman stepping down from the passenger car, her movements deliberate and graceful. Unlike the other passengers who chatted and called out greetings, she moved in a bubble of silence that felt familiar. Her eyes took in everything, missing nothing. Those were the eyes of someone used to watching, understanding without words. James added a quick sketch to his book, the curve of her shoulders as she gathered her skirts, the careful way she studied each face in the crowd. There was a story there, in the space between her gestures. He knew about such spaces, about the words that lived in silence. The woman glanced his direction, and for a moment their eyes met. James saw recognition there, not of his face, but of something deeper, the same watchfulness, the same careful reading of the world. Then Henry was waving for his attention again, pointing at the waiting supplies. James closed his sketchbook and turned to his tasks. But as he loaded his wagon, he found himself glancing back at the mysterious woman. She stood apart from the crowd now, her small trunk beside her, waiting, always watching, just as he did. His horse, Thunder, nickered as James approached with the supplies. The animal's movements transmitted through the ground, a language of vibration James had learned to read as clearly as any spoken word. He patted Thunder's neck, understanding the greeting in the gentle headbutt he received. The ranch waited 5 miles outside town, a place where James had carved out a life that didn't depend on hearing, where his hands could speak through work, through the care of animals, through the sketches that lined his cabin walls. But for the first time in years, he felt a pull to linger in town, to watch this woman who seemed to understand the eloquence of silence. Sarah stood beside her trunk, watching the tall rancher with the sketchbook load his wagon. There was something different in the way he moved, a heightened awareness of his surroundings that matched her own. When their eyes had met earlier, she'd felt seen in a way 5 potential husbands had failed to manage. A commotion near the station door drew her attention. Her new potential match, Mr. Davidson, was late. The station master consulted his pocket watch with growing concern, then approached her with an apologetic expression. "Miss Chen." He held out a telegram. "Just arrived for you." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. The words were brief, but clear. "Changed mind, stop, do not send bride, stop." Another rejection, this one before she'd even had a chance to fail. The station master shifted uncomfortably. "We can arrange return passage to San Francisco on tomorrow's train. Perhaps you'd like to wait in the station's reading room?" Sarah opened her journal, ready to write her response, when a shadow fell across the page. The rancher with the sketchbook stood before her, his eyes kind but questioning. He gestured to the telegram in her hand, then to himself, touching his ear and shaking his head. Understanding bloomed. He was deaf. Sarah hesitated only a moment before turning to a fresh page in her journal. In careful English, she wrote, "My intended match has changed his mind. I must return to San Francisco." He read her words, then pulled out his own well-worn book from his coat. Not a sketchbook this time, but a manual for sign language. He opened it to a marked page and pointed to an illustration, then demonstrated the sign for hello. Sarah found herself mimicking the gesture, her fingers forming the unfamiliar shape. His face lit up with a bright smile that transformed his weathered features. He quickly wrote in his own small notebook, "I'm James McAllister. Would you like to learn more?" The station master watched their exchange with growing interest. "Mr. McAllister, didn't you inquire about a bride some months back?" James nodded, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face as she studied the sign language book with intense concentration. She looked up at him and carefully signed hello again, adding a small, graceful bow that spoke of her Chinese heritage. He wrote again, "I have a ranch. It's not fancy, but it's good land. I've been looking for someone who understands that words aren't everything." Sarah's heart beat faster as she read his note. She wrote back, "Everyone says I'm too quiet." James smiled and signed something too quick for her to follow, then wrote, "I think you speak perfectly." The station master cleared his throat. "Miss Chen, Mr. McAllister is well respected in these parts, runs one of the best horse breeding operations in the territory. If you're interested, I could telegraph the marriage agency about the change." In circumstances, Sarah studied James's face, the intelligence in his eyes, the gentle way he held the sign language book as if offering her a key to his world. She wrote in her journal, "Could I see the ranch first?" His response was immediate. "Of course, no promises required, just two people learning each other's language." As James helped load her trunk into his wagon, whispers rippled through the station. Sarah caught fragments of conversation. "McAllister, Chinese girl, can't hear, can't speak." But for the first time, the whispers didn't sting. She watched James check the wagon's wheels and secure the supplies with practiced efficiency, every movement speaking of capability and care. He helped her up onto the wagon seat, then handed her the sign language book. She handed him her journal in return. A trade, her words for his, each offering a piece of themselves to the other. Thunder, sensing his master's good mood, pranced a bit as they pulled away from the station. Sarah felt the vibration of the wagon wheels, saw how James read the horse's movements through the reins. She opened the sign language book, fingers tracing the illustrations while the Wyoming landscape opened before them. Behind them, the station master was already composing a telegram to Mrs. Sullivan's marriage agency. Circumstances altered. Stop. Miss Chen found promising alternative. Stop, details to follow. Stop. The morning sun cast long shadows across James's kitchen table, where a Chinese-English dictionary lay open beside the sign language manual. Sarah traced her finger across a page, then carefully signed the word for tea before writing its Chinese character in her journal. James watched intently, his eyes following each stroke of her brush. Their first week together had developed its own rhythm. Dawn brought breakfast and simple signs. "Good morning? Hungry? Thank you." By midday, they worked side by side in the ranch's small garden, where Sarah had discovered familiar herbs among the western vegetables. Each plant became a lesson, a bridge between their worlds. James took out his notebook and wrote, "Your signs are becoming very graceful." Sarah smiled, adding a Chinese character beneath his English words. She pointed to it, then mimed its meaning, the flow of water over stones. James nodded, understanding. In her hands, sign language was becoming something new, blending with the elegant movements of her cultural heritage. A kettle whistled on the stove, its sound unheard by James, but seen in the rising steam. Sarah moved to prepare tea, her movements a dance of practiced precision. She'd brought the tea set from San Francisco, one of few luxuries she'd allowed herself. James had cleared a special shelf for it, understanding without words its importance to her. As she poured, James touched her arm gently and pointed outside. Through the window, they could see his neighbor, old Mrs. Henderson, making her way up the path. Sarah's hands trembled slightly. Meeting new people had always been the hardest part. James quickly wrote, "She's kind and very curious about my mysterious Chinese guest." He smiled, adding, "Show her how tea should really be served." "Your way." Mrs. Henderson's weathered face appeared at the door, which James opened with a welcoming gesture. Her eyes widened at the sight of the formal tea service, but her smile was genuine. "Well now," she said, speaking slowly and clearly, knowing James could read lips, "this is quite the civilized setup you've got here." Sarah bowed slightly and motioned to a chair. James wrote a quick note explaining the tea ceremony, which Mrs. Henderson read with interest. As Sarah went through the ritual, her confidence grew. The older woman watched, fascinated, as each step unfolded with graceful precision. After the first sip, Mrs. Henderson's eyes brightened. "Land sakes, I've never had tea like this. All these years drinking it wrong, seems like." James grinned and signed to Sarah, who was beginning to recognize common expressions. She wrote in her journal and showed them, "Tea is meant to be shared with friends." Mrs. Henderson studied the Chinese characters Sarah had added below the English. "That's mighty pretty writing. Could you show me how to make those marks?" For the next hour, the kitchen table became a classroom. Sarah demonstrated basic characters while James added the corresponding signs. Mrs. Henderson proved an eager student, even if her brushstrokes were shaky. As she left, carrying a small packet of tea leaves Sarah had insisted she take, Mrs. Henderson paused at the door. "You two seem to be figuring things out just fine," she said, her voice warm with approval. "Sometimes the good Lord knows better than we do what we need." After she'd gone, James wrote, "See, your silence speaks volumes." Sarah responded by teaching him the sign for harmony, then showed him how it resembled the Chinese character for the same word. His rough rancher's hands moved carefully, practicing until he had it right. That evening, as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, they sat on the porch, adding to their shared vocabulary. Sarah taught James to write sunset in Chinese, while he showed her how to describe colors in sign language. Between them, the dictionary and manual lay open, their pages ruffled by the warm Wyoming breeze. In her journal that night, Sarah wrote in a mixture of English, Chinese, and carefully drawn sign illustrations. "Here, in this place between languages, I'm finding my voice, and someone who finally hears it." The ranch ledger lay open on James's desk, its neat columns telling the story of years of careful management. Sarah ran her finger down the precise handwriting, understanding now why James's ranch thrived while others struggled. Every detail was documented. Rainfall amounts, breeding records, supply costs, each entry a testament to his methodical mind. In the 3 weeks since her arrival, she'd begun adding her own notes to the ledger, careful observations about which horses responded best to different approaches, which fields needed extra attention. James had smiled when he first saw her additions, written in both English and Chinese, accompanied by small diagrams that needed no translation. The morning sun found them in the stables, where James was teaching her about his prized horses. His hands moved in fluid signs as he explained each animal's personality. Sarah had learned that Thunder, his favorite stallion, had been born the same year James lost his hearing to scarlet fever. They'd grown up together, learning to communicate through touch and movement. Sarah approached a nervous mare, her movements slow and deliberate. James watched as she hummed a Chinese lullaby, the vibrations soothing the horse, even though neither James nor the animal could hear the melody. The mare's ears flicked forward, then relaxed. James touched her shoulder and signed, "You have good horse sense." She smiled, signing back with growing confidence. "They're like people. Sometimes silence is what they need." The ranch's daily rhythm had become a dance they performed together. James showed her how to read the weather in cloud patterns, while she taught him Chinese techniques for predicting rain by watching wildlife behavior. Their methods differed, but their conclusions matched more often than not. In the vegetable garden, Sarah had introduced Chinese planting methods that James recorded with interest in the ledger. She'd drawn detailed diagrams showing how certain plants protected others, a wisdom passed down through generations of farmers in her homeland. By midday, they were checking fence lines, riding side by side. Sarah had traded her traditional dress for practical riding clothes, though she'd embroidered Chinese luck symbols into the cuffs. James signed that her riding had improved considerably. She responded by demonstrating the new posting rhythm she'd developed, one that let her feel the horse's movements the way he did. They stopped to repair a loose post, working in seamless tandem. James held the post steady while Sarah secured the wire, their hands signing quick confirmations to each other. The efficiency of their partnership drew admiring comments from passing ranchers who'd initially doubted the wisdom of James taking in a Chinese bride who couldn't even speak proper. Back at the house, Sarah added the day's fence repair to the ledger while James prepared their evening meal. She'd been surprised to discover he was a competent cook, another skill developed during years of independent living. They'd begun combining their culinary knowledge, creating dishes that, like their communication, bridged their different worlds. As darkness fell, they sat on the porch reviewing the ledger's weekly totals. Sarah pointed to the rising profits from their new vegetable arrangements. James nodded, then showed her his plans for expanding the garden next season. A shooting star streaked across the sky. Sarah quickly taught James the Chinese sign for making a wish. He caught her hand as she finished the gesture, his calloused fingers gentle against hers. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, their hands still linked. In the dim lamplight, Sarah added a final entry to the day's ledger. Beyond the numbers and notes, she drew a small picture. Two riders on horseback, moving in perfect synchronization across an endless prairie. Below it, she wrote in 3 languages: English, Chinese, and sign, home. James saw the drawing and smiled, understanding everything she hadn't needed to say. He added his own note beside hers. 2 voices, 1 song. The Laramie Weekly Herald's gossip column lay folded on the general store counter, its fresh ink still smudging. Sarah caught glimpses of phrases as she selected supplies. Unusual arrangement and strange pair jumped from the page. The store owner's wife, Mrs. Crawford, made no attempt to hide her scrutiny as she tallied Sarah's purchases. "Will Mr. McAllister be settling the account?" Mrs. Crawford's voice dripped with doubt. "We don't usually extend credit to, well..." Sarah opened her journal, writing her response in clear English. "Cash payment today." She placed the exact amount on the counter, counted out carefully the night before with James's help. Mrs. Crawford's lips tightened as she read. "Speaking of reading," she said loudly, as if volume could bridge understanding, "does your kind actually know how, or are these just pretty drawings?" The bell above the door chimed as James entered, his timing perfect as always. He'd developed an uncanny sense for when Sarah might need him, though she'd never asked for protection. He smiled at Mrs. Crawford, then signed to Sarah, his movements deliberately slow and graceful. Sarah signed back, matching his calm demeanor. Mrs. Crawford watched their exchange, her expression shifting from disdain to uncertainty as she witnessed their elegant communication. "Well, I never," she muttered, pushing the wrap packages across the counter. James took out his notebook, writing, "We'll need extra sugar for the preserve-making demonstration at Mrs. Henderson's tomorrow. And tea, the good kind Sarah likes." Mrs. Crawford's eyebrows rose. The preserve-making circle was an exclusive group of the town's most respected women. Old Mrs. Henderson's invitation to Sarah had ruffled more than a few feathers. Outside the store, the autumn wind carried snippets of conversation from passing townspeople. "Did you hear? Chinese girl, deaf rancher. What kind of marriage?" Sarah had learned to read the shape of whispers on lips, just as James had taught her. They loaded their supplies into the wagon, their movements synchronized from practice. A group of children stopped to watch them, fascinated by their sign language. One little girl, braver than the rest, approached with a sheet of paper clutched in her hand. It was the latest edition of the Herald. The gossip column featured a crude sketch of James and Sarah, suggesting something almost sinister about their silent communication. Sarah felt James stiffen beside her as he saw it, but the little girl wasn't interested in the newspaper's opinion. "Can you teach me to talk with my hands?" she asked, looking at them both with earnest curiosity. "Like you do?" Before either could respond, the girl's mother rushed over, pulling her away. "Nancy, don't bother them!" James quickly wrote in his notebook, showing it to the girl before she was dragged too far. "Come by the ranch with your ma sometime. We'll teach you." At the post office, more whispers followed them. Sarah submitted her weekly letter to her family in San Francisco, each envelope thick with carefully written pages describing her new life. The postmaster, Mr. Roberts, was one of the few who treated them with consistent kindness. "People talk," he said as he weighed her letter, "but they talked about James before you came, and he proved them all wrong then too. Running the best horse operation in the territory has a way of changing minds." Sarah nodded, then wrote in her journal, "Time teaches more than words ever could." Mr. Roberts smiled, stamping her letter. "Ain't that the truth?" As they drove home, the wagon heavy with supplies, Sarah noticed James was unusually quiet, his hands still on the reins. She touched his arm, then signed, "Their whispers can't touch us." He smiled, the tension leaving his shoulders. At a bend in the road, he stopped the wagon. From this height, they could see their ranch in the distance, the neat fences, the thriving garden, the horses grazing peacefully, their shared work visible in every detail. James pulled out his notebook one last time that day. "Let them whisper. We'll speak through what we build together." Sarah took the pencil, adding beneath his words, "and through what we teach others." That evening, as they reviewed the day's work, Sarah pasted the newspaper article into her journal, not in anger or shame, but as a reminder. Beneath it, she wrote in flowing Chinese characters, then signed the meaning to James. "Pearls form around irritants. What others see as strange, we will make beautiful." Sarah's recipe book sat open on the kitchen counter, its pages a blend of Eastern and Western cuisines. Chinese characters mingled with English annotations, and pressed herbs dotted the margins. The book had become a living document of her new life, each recipe telling the story of another bridge built. Today's page featured her mother's mooncake recipe adapted for Mrs. Henderson's preserve-making circle. Sarah had spent hours perfecting the substitution of local berries for traditional lotus paste, determined to create something that would speak to both worlds. The kitchen was alive with warmth and movement as 5 of the town's most influential women watched her work. James sat in the corner, sketching the scene while occasionally interpreting Sarah's graceful signs for their guests. "Look how she folds the dough," Mrs. Henderson commented, leaning closer. "Never seen anything like it." Mrs. Crawford, who had come despite her earlier disdain, couldn't hide her fascination. "The pattern it makes, it's like art." Sarah smiled, then demonstrated how to crimp the edges using a technique passed down through generations of her family. The women leaned in, trying to copy her movements. Their first attempts were clumsy, but Sarah guided their hands with patient gestures. "Land sakes!" Mrs. Peterson exclaimed as Sarah opened the oven. "That smell like heaven itself!" The mooncakes emerged golden and perfect, their intricate patterns telling stories in dough. While they cooled, Sarah served tea in the formal style James had come to love. The women's chatter softened as they observed the ritual, something shifting in their expressions as they recognized the skill and dedication in each precise movement. James caught Sarah's eye and signed, "Show them the herb garden next." The women followed them outside, where Sarah's careful integration of Chinese medicinal herbs with Western plants had created something unique. Mrs. Crawford stopped abruptly at the sight of her daughter Nancy, who was already there, hands moving, in careful signs as she practiced with thunder. "Nancy?" Mrs. Crawford's voice held surprise and a touch of concern. James stepped forward, notebook ready. "She has a gift with horses. Been coming by to learn signing. Thunder trusts her." They watched as Nancy signed a simple command she'd learned. Thunder responded perfectly, executing a gentle turn. The girl's face glowed with accomplishment. "She was so shy before," Mrs. Crawford whispered, something softening in her face. "Hardly spoke at all." Sarah opened her recipe book to a blank page and wrote, "Sometimes the quietest hearts have the most to say. They just need their own language." As the afternoon progressed, the women's questions shifted from polite curiosity to genuine interest. They wanted to know about Chinese medicine, about Sarah's gardening techniques, about the way she and James had blended their different approaches to ranch work. Mrs. Henderson watched Nancy teaching Mrs. Peterson's youngest daughter the sign for friend. "Well," she declared, "seems to me we've been blessed with some special teaching in this town. About time we started learning." When the women left, their arms full of mooncakes and their minds full of new ideas, the kitchen kept its warmth. James pulled Sarah close, signing against her palm. "You've given them a new way to listen." Sarah added a note to her recipe book, a simple entry that meant everything. Today, mooncake spoke louder than words. That evening, a knock at the door revealed Nancy and her mother. Mrs. Crawford held a jar of fresh preserves, a peace offering of sorts. "Nancy was wondering," she said, her eyes lowered, "if you might be willing to teach a proper signing class for children who might need it. And maybe," she hesitated, "for their mothers too." Sarah's hands moved in beautiful signs, which James translated, "Every new language opens another heart." Mrs. Crawford nodded, understanding perhaps for the first time that silence could hold its own kind of eloquence. Later, Sarah added a new section to her recipe book, Teaching Recipes. The first entry wasn't for food at all, but for connection. The basic signs for welcome, friend, and family, illustrated with the same care she gave to her most treasured dishes. James contributed his own notes, sketching hands in various positions, adding arrows for movement. Together, they were creating not just a recipe book, but a guide to their unique way of being in the world, a world where silence held flavor and gestures carried the sweetness of acceptance. The weather-damaged family photograph trembled in James's hands as he rushed to secure it. It was the only image he had of his parents, taken just months before the fever that stole his hearing. Sarah watched him tuck it carefully into his shirt pocket as the sky turned an ominous green-black above their ranch. She'd seen that color once before, in San Francisco during a terrible storm. But this was different. The Wyoming air felt heavy, electric. The horses in the paddock moved restlessly, their anxiety vibrating through the ground in ways both she and James could feel. Thunder, living up to his name, whinnied sharply. James was already moving, reading the horses' behavior as clearly as Sarah read the Chinese almanac's weather warnings. They had perhaps an hour before the storm hit, and too much to secure. Sarah grabbed her journal, quickly sketching a plan. Of the ranch, She divided the page in two, marking critical areas for each of them to cover. James nodded at her efficiency, adding a few notes about the new foal that would need special protection. They worked with urgent precision. Sarah gathered the younger horses while James secured the barn doors. Between them flew quick signs, made sharper and more essential by the rising wind. No wasted movements, no hesitation. Each understood exactly what the other needed. The first massive drops fell as Sarah helped James strengthen the garden fence. They'd worked too hard on their blended garden to lose it now. Chinese medicinal herbs grew alongside Western vegetables, each plant precious to their growing trade. With townspeople, a sharp crack of lightning illuminated James's face. Though he couldn't hear the thunder, he felt its rumble through the earth. His expression changed, hands signing rapidly. "Storm cellar now," but Sarah pointed urgently toward the far pasture. Through the growing sheets of rain, they could see the new foal had panicked, broken through a fence, and was running straight toward the creek, which was already beginning to swell. No time for discussion. Sarah pressed James's father's photograph deeper into his pocket, then signed, "I'm lighter, faster. Trust me." Before he could protest, she was running. Years of practiced silence made her movement swift and sure, even in the deteriorating conditions. James watched her for only a moment before turning to prepare the storm cellar. They each had their tasks now. Sarah reached the creek, just as the foal did. The young horse reared in panic at another lightning strike, but Sarah stood her ground. She began humming, not for the sound, but for the vibration, the same technique she'd used to calm nervous horses since arriving at the ranch. The foal's ears flicked forward, recognizing her. Sarah kept humming, her hands moving in the gentle gestures James had taught her for horse handling. Step by step, she drew closer. Behind her, the storm's fury grew. Wind whipped her hair free, and the rain made it hard to see. But her movements remained calm, deliberate. The foal needed to feel her certainty. Finally, her hand touched its quivering neck. In that moment, another lightning bolt illuminated the entire valley, showing her how the creek had become a rushing torrent. They needed to move now. Sarah guided the foal back toward the ranch, choosing her path carefully on the increasingly muddy ground. Through the curtain of rain, she saw James emerge from the storm cellar, his hands raised to sign, "This way!" They reached the barn just as the full force of the storm hit. James had prepared a special stall with extra bedding, tucked away from the worst of the wind. Together, they settled the foal, their hands moving in silent communication over its care. Only when the young horse was calm did James pull Sarah into a fierce embrace. He drew back to sign, "Brave, foolish, perfect." She smiled through her dripping hair and signed back, "Learned from you." They made their way to the storm cellar as the wind howled above. James pulled out the photograph, checking it was safe. Sarah lit the lamp they kept there, illuminating the small space they'd prepared for just such emergencies. In its light, James showed her the photograph properly for the first time. His parents smiled from the sepia image, his father's hand resting proudly on young James's shoulder. Sarah traced their faces gently, then signed, "They gave you strength. You gave me courage." James took out his notebook, its pages slightly damp but still usable. He wrote, "We give each other language." Above them, the storm raged on. But in their snug cellar, they continued their quiet conversation, hands moving in the lamplight, telling stories of courage and trust, of fears faced together, of a language built between hearts. Sarah wrote in her journal, which she'd managed to keep dry, "Today I learned that love speaks loudest in moments of silence, when actions say what words cannot." The damaged fence post stood as a testament to deliberate malice, its fresh-cut Chinese characters gouged deeply by a hostile hand. Beside the vandalism, James's ranch brand had been carved mockingly. Sarah ran her fingers over the markings, recognizing the words for outsider and silence among the crude strokes. James touched her shoulder, drawing her attention to approaching horses. Through the morning mist, she recognized Mr. Patterson, her former intended match, riding alongside two members of the town council. "McAllister!" Patterson's voice carried across the pasture. "Time we had words about this situation." James stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Sarah. His notebook was already in hand, but Patterson ignored it, speaking with exaggerated slowness. "Town's concerned about the influence you two are having, teaching our children foreign ways, strange signs." He gestured toward Nancy Crawford, who was helping with the horses in the distance, filling their heads with ideas about different, being acceptable. Sarah opened her journal, but Patterson snatched it from her hands, letting it fall into the mud. "No more of your chicken scratch. This is American soil. We speak English here." James's hands moved in sharp, clear signs that needed no translation, his expression thunderous. He reached for Sarah's journal, but one of the councilmen dismounted, blocking his path. "Now see here, McAllister. You were strange enough before, but we tolerated it because you ran a good operation. But this," he waved towards Sarah, "teaching our children to be silent like her, it ain't natural." Sarah felt James trembling with rage beside her. She touched his arm, then bent to retrieve her journal. With deliberate grace, she wiped it clean and wrote in perfect English. "Our students learn 3 languages, English, Chinese, sign. Knowledge is strength, not weakness." "Knowledge?" Patterson spat. "You call those hand-wavings knowledge and these foreign markings?" He kicked the fence post. "For all we know, you're teaching spells and wickedness." Nancy had noticed the confrontation and was running toward them. Sarah saw Mrs. Crawford following, her face worried. Other ranch hands were drawing closer too, drawn by the tension in the air. James wrote quickly, "Leave my property, now." "Property?" The second councilman laughed harshly. "That's rich. Way we hear it. You never filed proper ownership papers after your pa died. Been meaning to look into that, given the circumstances." Sarah felt James go still. She knew his father had left everything in order, but the documents were old, potentially vulnerable to reinterpretation by hostile officials. Then Nancy reached them, her small hands flying in the signs Sarah had taught her. "Miss Sarah, the new foal is dancing, just like you showed me." Mrs. Crawford arrived, breathless. "Nancy, come away." She stopped, taking in the scene. Her eyes fell on Sarah's muddied journal, then rose to Patterson's satisfied smirk. Something shifted in her expression. "Mr. Patterson," she said clearly, "my daughter could barely speak to strangers before Miss Sarah taught her a new way to express herself. Now she's top of her class in reading and writing." She turned to the councilman. "And you both know your wives have been asking for her medicine for their gardens." Other voices joined in. Ranch hands spoke of James's fair treatment and Sarah's helpful remedies. A young stable boy demonstrated proudly how he could now communicate with James without confusion. Patterson's face darkened. "This isn't about some herbs or hand signs. This is about proper order, natural ways." Sarah straightened, drawing out her pencil. In her journal she wrote words she'd practiced for weeks. "The only unnatural thing here is fear of difference." James took the journal, adding, "My father's papers are filed with the territorial office, certified copies in the bank vault. Touch our ranch, and I'll have the governor's office reviewing every land deal this council has ever made." The councilman shifted uncomfortably. They knew James's reputation for meticulous records. If he said he had documentation, he did. Patterson glared at Sarah. "This ain't over. You don't belong here, girl. Never will." As they rode away, James and Sarah stood together before the damaged fence post. She traced the crude characters, then took out her carving knife. With precise strokes, she began transforming the ugly marks into something new. By sunset, the post bore a proper Chinese blessing intertwined with James's ranch brand, the characters flowing around it like a protective embrace. Below, Sarah added a new carving, hands shaped in signs of hope, strength, and unity. James brought paint, and together they filled the carvings with bold colors that would be visible from the road. A declaration, not a defense. In her journal that evening, Sarah wrote, "Some try to build fences between hearts. We will turn their barriers into bridges." The handwritten wedding invitation lay unfinished on their kitchen table, its carefully crafted bilingual text, a testament to their determination. Sarah's Chinese calligraphy flowed alongside Western script, while delicate illustrations of hands, signing love and forever, decorated the margins. "You don't have to do this," James wrote in his notebook. "We could marry quietly, just us and a few friends." Sarah's response was to dip her brush in ink and continue writing. Each stroke was deliberate, transforming their declaration of love into a statement of belonging. The invitation wasn't just for a wedding, it was for the entire town to witness. Their union and the bridging of their worlds. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Crawford, faces grim with news. The town council had called an emergency meeting. The topic, foreign influences and community standards. James's jaw tightened, but Sarah was already reaching for her good coat. She'd worn it 5 times before, to face 5 rejections. Today it would serve a different purpose. The town hall was packed when they arrived. Patterson stood at the podium, his voice carrying through the crowded room. "These foreign ways are spreading, children neglecting proper speech for hand-waving. Women abandoning trusted medicines for Chinese herbs. Where does it end?" Sarah felt the stares, heard the whispers. But now she recognized friendly faces in the crowd, students from their signing classes, mothers whose children had found new confidence, ranchers who'd seen their success with horses. Nancy Crawford pushed through the crowd, her hands flying. "In elegant signs, Miss Sarah taught me to speak with my hands when my words felt too big. Now I can say everything in my heart." The girl's mother stood. "My daughter was called slow and simple because speaking was hard for her. Now she's teaching other children to sign. Tell me how that's foreign influence worth fearing." James stepped forward, his notebook ready, but Sarah touched his arm. It was her turn to speak. She walked to the podium, her steps measured and calm. The room fell silent as she withdrew her journal and began to write on the large presentation slate. "I came to America seeking belonging. 5 times I was rejected for being too quiet. But silence holds wisdom where words fail. Ask your horses, who trust touch more than shouts. Ask your gardens, which grow stronger with patient tending than rough handling. Ask your children, who learn best when we listen to their hearts." She paused, then continued writing. "James and I are getting married. We invite every one of you to come see how love speaks in all languages." As she wrote the Chinese character for harmony, then demonstrated its sign equivalent, a murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Henderson stood up. "I'm not much for speeches," the old woman said, "but I know this. My arthritis hasn't plagued me. Since Sarah showed me her grandfather's remedies, that's not foreign influence. That's God's wisdom coming through different hands." One by one, others stood. The blacksmith spoke of how James's ranch had prospered, through methods that combined Western ranching with Chinese farming wisdom. A mother testified about her son's stutter easing once he learned he could sign his thoughts first. Patterson tried to regain control. "This isn't about individual cases. It's about maintaining our way of life." "Our way of life?" Mrs. Crawford's voice rang out clear. "Was that our way of life when my Nancy cried herself to sleep because words wouldn't come? When we called children slow because they didn't speak like us? When we rejected wisdom because it came with different eyes?" James moved to stand beside Sarah at the podium. Together, they held up their wedding invitation. The Chinese characters caught the light, dancing alongside English script and sign language illustrations, 3 ways of speaking love. The town council chairman, who had been silent until now, cleared his throat. "Seems to me," he said slowly, "that any way of life worth maintaining has room for growth. Motion to conclude this meeting, and," he smiled slightly, "I believe I hear wedding bells in our future." As the crowd dispersed, many lingering to examine the invitation and ask about the ceremony, Sarah added a final note to her journal. Sometimes the quietest revolution begins with an invitation to understand. That evening, as they sat on their porch addressing invitations, James signed against her palm. "You spoke louder today than any voice could." Sarah's response was to guide his hands through the Chinese character for courage, showing him how it contained the symbol for heart. Together they added it to their invitation's design, one more bridge built between their worlds. Each envelope they sealed felt like a key turning, unlocking doors that fear had closed. Their wedding wouldn't just be a ceremony. It would be a demonstration of how love could speak in any language, if only hearts were willing to listen. The community notice board outside the general store had transformed over the past weeks. Alongside the usual announcements of church socials and cattle auctions, new bilingual postings caught the eye. Chinese characters flowed beside English text, while simple drawings demonstrated sign language basics. It had become a symbol of the town's gradual awakening. Sarah stood before it now, pinning up a notice for their next teaching session. What had begun as informal lessons for Nancy had grown into regular classes held in the church basement. The schedule showed different levels: beginning signs for young children, Chinese language basics for interested adults, and special sessions for families with deaf or speech-challenged members. Mrs. Crawford emerged from the store, arms full of supplies. "Sarah, just the person I needed." She nodded toward the items she carried. "Could use your eyes on these. Trying to stock some of those herbs you mentioned. Figure if people are going to use them, they ought to get them proper instead of wild gathered wrong." Sarah smiled, taking out her journal to make recommendations. As they discussed proper storage methods for different herbs, she noticed more townspeople gathering around the notice board, copying down the simple signs illustrated there. A commotion from the street drew their attention. James was leading a training session with several ranchers, demonstrating his techniques for gentling difficult horses. His methods, combining Western horsemanship with the quiet awareness he'd developed through years of reading horses' body language, had gained attention after word spread about how he and Sarah had saved the foal during the storm. "It's something to see," Mrs. Crawford commented, watching the men follow James's silent instructions. "How he teaches them to listen with their eyes. Makes a body wonder what else we've been missing by only trusting our ears." The lesson ended, and James joined them at the notice board. His hands moved in fluid signs as he greeted them both. Mrs. Crawford responded with careful signs of her own, beaming with pride when James nodded approval at her improvement. Sarah added another notice to the board, this one announcing the formation of a weekly social circle where signing, English, and Chinese would all be welcome. Mrs. Henderson had suggested it, noting how the language lessons had begun building unexpected friendships across the community. A group of children ran past, their hands moving in a mixture of signs and games. They'd created their own secret language, blending signs they'd learned with playful innovations of their own. Sarah caught fragments of their conversation, signs for horse and adventure, mixed with Chinese words for friend and secret. James tapped the notice board and signed, "Look what you started." But Sarah shook her head and responded, "What we started." Together. They watched as Mr. Roberts, the postmaster, helped a young mother learn the signs posted for milk, hurt, and help. Her infant son, born with difficulty speaking, would grow up in a town that had learned there were many ways to hear a voice. Even Patterson's wife had begun attending the herb sessions, though her husband remained coldly distant. She'd confided to Mrs. Henderson that her garden had never bloomed so well, and her daughter's persistent cough had eased with Sarah's tea blend. The town's children had proven the quickest to embrace change. They flocked to the ranch for riding lessons, knowing they'd learn not just horsemanship, but also new ways to communicate. James's quiet confidence and Sarah's gentle patience created an environment where difference was no longer something to fear. A deaf child from a neighboring town had recently begun staying with relatives in Laramie to attend their lessons. His parents had written a letter, now posted on the notice board, describing how their son had bloomed since finding others who could understand him. Sarah added the letter to her growing collection of community memories. Each note, drawing, and letter represented another small bridge built, another barrier fallen. The Chinese-English dictionary she'd brought from San Francisco was now well worn from frequent lending, its pages marked with notes from eager learners. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the notice board, James and Sarah headed home. They passed the school, where Nancy was teaching a younger student to sign the alphabet. Beyond her, a group of women gathered in Mrs. Henderson's garden, sharing knowledge of both Western and Chinese planting techniques. "Tomorrow," James signed, "the governor's wife visits to learn about our teaching program." Sarah nodded. Word had spread beyond Laramie about their unique community. What had begun as a love story between two people who spoke without words had grown into something larger, a testament to the power of listening with more than ears. In her journal that evening, Sarah wrote, "A single bridge between hearts can lead to bridges everywhere. All it takes is the courage to build the first one." The handmade quilt grew beneath Sarah's fingers as the blizzard raged outside, each patch telling its own story. Western calico nestled against silk scraps from her mother's old dresses, while embroidered Chinese symbols danced alongside traditional American patterns. Like everything in their life together, the quilt was becoming a bridge between worlds. 3 days into the worst winter storm anyone could remember, their ranch had become a refuge. The Henderson family had arrived first, their own home's roof, threatening collapse under the snow's weight. The Crawfords followed, then others, until the house hummed with quiet activity despite the howling wind outside. James moved through the crowded rooms with practiced ease, his awareness of space and movement making him an unexpectedly graceful host, even in the cramped conditions. He'd insisted on bringing in the most vulnerable livestock, turning their barn into an ark of horses, cattle, and even a few sheep from neighboring farms. Sarah's Chinese medicines and Western first aid supplies covered the kitchen table, organized with clear labels in both languages and accompanying signs drawn beneath. Mrs. Patterson, who'd come without her husband when their youngest developed, a fever, watched intently as Sarah demonstrated how to prepare a throat-soothing tea. "My mother swore by whiskey and honey," Mrs. Patterson admitted, "but this brings the fever down gentler." The children had created a game of practicing signs while wrapped in blankets near the fire. Nancy led them, teaching the younger ones how to sign stories about the storm. Their small hands shaped words for snow, wind, and safe, adding dramatic flourishes that made the adults smile. Through the kitchen window, Sarah caught glimpses of other ranchers arriving on horseback, bringing news of families isolated by the storm. Without discussion, she began preparing more healing packets while James organized the strongest riders for supply deliveries. Their preparations were interrupted by Thunder's distinctive warning stamp from the barn. James felt the vibration and was moving before Sarah could sign to him. She followed, wrapping herself in the unfinished quilt. They found a young ranch hand, barely conscious, half frozen in the barn doorway. He'd ridden through the storm to warn them, the Hendersons. Oldest boy was trapped at their property, trying to save their remaining livestock. The next hours tested everything they'd built together. James organized a rescue party, while Sarah prepared medicines and heated blankets. Their home became a command center, with children running messages and adults working in focused silence. What amazed the townspeople most was how smoothly everything worked without raised voices. Hand signals, written notes, and simple gestures kept everyone coordinated. Those who'd learned signing found themselves teaching others out of necessity, and those who'd resisted learning before now watched intently. Sarah kept the quilting circle going through the long hours of waiting, teaching the women how to incorporate Chinese luck symbols into their stitching. The repetitive motion calmed nerves, while the shared work gave worried hands purpose. "Never thought I'd be sowing Chinese blessings," Mrs. Crawford mused, her needle flashing. "But Lord knows we need all the help we can get tonight." Near midnight, Thunder's warning came again. This time it brought relief, the rescue party returning with the Henderson boy and most of his animals. As Sarah helped tend to minor frostbite, she noticed Mrs. Patterson using signs she'd learned just hours before to ask for more bandages. The storm raged for 2 more days. They rotated sleeping spaces, shared stories, and learned new ways to communicate when voices were too tired to work. The quilt grew longer, gaining patches from every family present, each one sewn with newly learned stitches that blended east and west. When the sky finally cleared, their home had been transformed. Chinese herbs hung drying alongside Western remedies, children's drawings of sign language mixed with traditional decorations. The quilt, finished during those long hours of waiting and watching, draped across the back of James's father's old chair, a symbol of warmth created by many hands. As families began the slow process of returning home, checking damages and helping neighbors dig out, something had shifted. The storm had forced them to learn each other's languages, to rely on silent understanding when words alone wouldn't suffice. Sarah found a note tucked into her medicine box, written in Mrs. Patterson's careful hand. "Some wisdom speaks in whispers, and some strength comes without sound. Thank you for teaching us to listen with more than our ears." That evening, as James and Sarah finally had their home to themselves again, they wrapped the new quilt around their shoulders and stood on the porch, watching the community they'd helped build work together to rebuild after the storm. Sarah's journal entry that night was simple. "In the silence of the storm, they finally heard us. In learning our language, they found their own new ways to speak." The garden layout spread across their kitchen table, its carefully drawn plans showing how Chinese vegetables would grow alongside Western crops. Sarah's brush moved with sure strokes as she added notes about companion planting, which plants would strengthen each other just as their 2 cultures had. James leaned over her shoulder, adding his own notes about irrigation techniques he'd developed. The winter storm had taught them all about survival, but spring whispered of possibility. Their garden would feed more than just their household now. It would help supply the weekly market they'd proposed to the town council. A stack of letters from Sarah's family in San Francisco sat nearby, containing seeds her mother had carefully packed along with wedding wishes. The Chinese characters of her mother's writing flowed with joy and pride, celebrating how her quiet daughter had found not just acceptance, but purpose. "Your father says the winter peas should be planted first," Sarah signed to James, translating from the letter. "He's drawn diagrams for proper spacing." James nodded, adding the information to their plan. They'd expanded the garden plot significantly, aided by volunteers from town who'd stayed on after the storm to help prepare for spring. Even Patterson had grudgingly offered his team of horses for the heavy ploughing, though he still wouldn't speak directly to them. Mrs. Henderson arrived with her basket of seedlings, already sprouting from lessons Sarah had taught during the long winter nights. "These Chinese greens of yours," she said, signing as she spoke, "they're hardier than anything I've grown before." Other townspeople followed, bringing tools, seeds, and questions. The garden had become a gathering place where signing hands discussed planting techniques and children proudly showed off their growing vocabulary in both Chinese and sign language. Nancy Crawford, who'd appointed herself official translator for new visitors, was teaching a group of younger children how to sign the names of different vegetables. She'd created a song that blended English words, Chinese terms, and signs, a playful hybrid that perfectly captured their community's evolution. The governor's wife wrote again, Mrs. Crawford mentioned, helping to mark out new beds. She's determined to start similar programs in other towns, wants to know if you'll help train teachers. Sarah looked at James, who smiled and signed, "Your choice, always." She took out her journal and wrote for everyone to see. "First, we grow strong roots here. Then we help others grow their own gardens." The afternoon sun warmed their backs as they worked, the soil coming alive beneath their hands. Sarah showed them how to create raised beds in the Chinese style, while James demonstrated his method of reading the land's natural contours for optimal drainage. Thunder nickered from his paddock, drawing their attention to new arrivals. Henderson's oldest boy, recovered from his winter ordeal, led a group of ranchers interested in learning James's horse-gentling techniques. The winter had proven how valuable calm, well-trained horses could be in a crisis. "We're thinking," young Henderson said, and signed simultaneously, "of making this a proper training center. Horses, languages, farming, everything you both can. Teach." Sarah felt James's hand slip into hers, squeezing gently. They dreamed of something like this during those long winter nights, but hadn't dared voice it too loudly. She drew out the second set of plans they'd been working on, designs for expanding the ranch to include proper teaching spaces. James had sketched classrooms with large windows for clear signing visibility, gardens dedicated to teaching plots, and expanded stables for training sessions. The gathered townspeople passed the plans around, adding suggestions, offering help. Mrs. Patterson quietly mentioned that her husband's unused north field would be perfect for the expanded horse training area, her eyes suggesting she'd find a way to convince him. As the sun began to set, Sarah added final notes to their garden layout. Among the practical planting instructions, she'd drawn small symbols combining Chinese characters with sign language illustrations: hope, growth, community. James traced them with a gentle finger, then signed, "Like us, growing together." Nancy, helping to pack up tools, asked, "Will you teach us how to write these symbols too? They tell stories in themselves, don't they?" Sarah nodded, adding one final character to the plans, the one for future, drawn with strokes that flowed like new leaves unfurling in spring sunshine. The traditional Chinese wedding dress lay across Sarah's bed, its red silk gleaming in the morning light. Her sister May's clever hands had modified the design, incorporating Western elements while maintaining its essential character. Like everything in Sarah's life now, it bridged two worlds with grace. "It's perfect," May signed carefully, having insisted on learning basic signs before making the journey from San Francisco. "Just like your James." Sarah smoothed the fabric, noting how May had subtly embroidered small hands signing love among the traditional patterns. Their mother had sent the silk, but the design was pure May, bold enough to embrace change while honoring tradition. A knock at the door revealed Mrs. Henderson, her face flushed with excitement. "He's here," she signed and spoke. "James's brother Thomas just got off the train." Sarah's heart tightened. James hadn't seen his brother since their father's funeral 5 years ago. Thomas had never accepted his brother's deafness, viewing it as a weakness that threatened the ranch's future. Their final argument had been about James's decision to stay and run the ranch alone rather than sell it. Through the window, Sarah watched James walk toward the station, his steps measured but tense. She'd learned to read his emotions in the set of his shoulders, the rhythm of his stride. Right now, every line of his body spoke of guarded hope. May touched her arm. "Go with him," she signed. "Some bridges need extra support while they're being built." Sarah hurried to catch up, falling into step beside James. He gave her a grateful smile, reaching for her hand as they approached his. "Brother!" Thomas stood awkwardly by his luggage, looking older than Sarah had expected from James's descriptions. "Jimmy," Thomas said, then stopped, realizing his childhood nickname for his brother no longer fit the confident man before him. He fumbled, with a piece of paper reading carefully rehearsed signs. "I'm sorry, I was wrong." James stood very still, then reached for his notebook, but Thomas held up his hand. "No," he said, signing slowly, clumsily. I learn your way now. The signs were crude, learned by mail from Nancy Crawford over the past months, but they represented something profound. A willingness to step into his brother's world instead of demanding James live in his. Sarah felt James's hand tremble. In hers, as he signed back, his movements gentle, simplified for his brother's understanding. Welcome home. The afternoon brought more arrivals. Sarah's cousin Wei Lin, who'd married a railroad worker and settled in Denver, came bearing gifts and stories from their extended family. The house filled with a mixture of Chinese, English, and sign language, as everyone worked to communicate across their different worlds. May and Thomas found themselves seated together at dinner, sharing their experiences of watching their siblings build something unexpected. Though they needed Nancy's help to translate, their laughter needed no interpretation. You know, Thomas said during a quiet moment, I fought this because I thought Jimmy was letting his disability isolate him. He watched his brother across the room, teaching Wei Lin to sign her name. I never imagined he'd use it to bring people together like this. May nodded, her hands moving in the graceful signs she'd learned. Sometimes what the world sees as weakness becomes strength when given room to grow. The wedding dress became a gathering point, as women from both families added their own touches. Mrs. Crawford contributed delicate lace for the cuffs, while Wei Lin sewed a traditional Chinese button knot. Each addition honored both innovation and tradition. That evening, as families mingled on the porch, enjoying May's mooncakes and Mrs. Henderson's rhubarb pie, Sarah wrote in her journal, Today I watched my sister sign with James's brother, saw Chinese hands shape Western words, and Western hands learn Chinese blessings. Our families are learning that love needs no single language to speak its truth. James found her later, as stars began to dot the Wyoming sky. He signed against her palm, They're all here, both our families. Sarah corrected him gently, gesturing to include the townspeople who'd become part of their extended family. Nancy was teaching Thomas and Wei Lin a game that involved both signs and Chinese counting. Mrs. Henderson and May were exchanging recipe secrets with a mix of gestures and drawings. All our families, she signed back, the ones we were born to, and the ones we built together. Thomas approached them, his signs still awkward but determined. Father would be proud of both of you. James pulled his brother into a fierce embrace, years of distance dissolving in shared tears. Sarah felt May's arms slip around her waist as they watched the brothers reconnect. See, May whispered in Chinese, then signed, Some silences speak of healing. The wedding certificate lay ready on the church altar, its unique design reflecting the ceremony it would witness. Written in flowing English script, Chinese characters, and illustrated with sign language, it waited to record a union unlike any Laramie had seen before. Dawn light filtered through the church windows as Sarah stood before the mirror in the side room. The modified wedding dress caught the light, its red silk harmonizing with Western lace. May made final adjustments, while Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Crawford wove flowers into Sarah's hair, Wyoming wildflowers mixed with paper blossoms May had crafted from letters their mother sent. Look, Nancy signed from the doorway, her hands shaping excitement. Everyone's coming. Through the window, Sarah watched the town gather. Ranchers in their best suits rode in alongside Chinese railway workers Wei Lin had invited. Children ran about in new clothes, their hands flying in signs they'd learned specially for the ceremony. James waited at the front of the church, with Thomas beside him. His fingers moved restlessly, practicing the Chinese wedding blessing he'd learned. For Sarah's family, Thomas reached out and steadied his brother's hands, signing with newfound confidence, She already knows your heart. The ceremony they'd designed wove together threads from both their worlds. Reverend Anderson had worked with them for weeks, learning to incorporate Chinese traditions and sign language into the service. Now he stood ready, his own hands prepared to sign the crucial parts. Sarah's entrance brought a hush to the crowd. She moved with measured grace, each step a meditation, as her mother had taught her. James watched her approach, his eyes speaking volumes in the eloquent silence they shared. The Reverend began in English, his words accompanied by Nancy's clear, signing for the deaf guests who'd traveled from neighboring towns. Then Wei Lin stepped forward to speak the Chinese blessing, her voice carrying her grandmother's ancient words, while Mrs. Crawford, to everyone's surprise, signed their meaning. When it came time for their vows, James and Sarah faced each other. Their hands moved in a dance they'd choreographed together, combining the elegance of Chinese tradition with the poetry of sign language. No translation was needed. The love in their movements spoke directly to the heart. James signed, "In a world of noise, you taught me that silence holds wisdom. Through your quiet strength, I learned to listen with my heart." Sarah's response flowed from her hands. "In a world that demanded voice, you showed me that love speaks in many languages. Through your understanding, I found my true words." Together, they signed, "We bridge worlds, not just for ourselves, but for all who seek new ways to speak their truth." The exchange of rings incorporated Chinese red ribbon, symbolizing the ties that bound their destinies. As they tied the knot together, Thomas and May stepped forward with the wedding certificate, each signed as witness. Thomas in careful Chinese characters he'd practiced for weeks, May in the sign language she'd mastered for the occasion. When the Reverend pronounced them married, the celebration erupted in 3 languages at once: cheers in English, congratulations in Chinese, and a flutter of signing hands that looked like doves taking flight. The reception brought together traditions with the same grace as the ceremony. Tables groaned under the weight of mooncakes alongside Henderson's famous pies. Children taught their parents the sign language games Sarah and James had invented, while Chinese elders demonstrated calligraphy to fascinated ranchers. Patterson appeared briefly at the edge of the celebration. Though he didn't stay, he nodded once to the couple, a small gesture but one that spoke of grudging acceptance. His wife, now one of Sarah's most dedicated students in Chinese herbalism, beamed and signed congratulations. As evening fell, lanterns were lit, red paper ones from China glowing alongside Western hurricane lamps. Under their mingled light, Sarah and James danced. No music was needed. They moved to the rhythm they'd always shared, their bodies speaking the language they'd created together. Nancy gathered the children to sign a blessing she'd composed herself, their small hands shaping words of hope and unity. Watching them, Zara saw the future they'd helped build, one where silence held its own song and love spoke in whatever language the heart chose. The wedding certificate, signed and witnessed, bore their story in 3 scripts, but its most powerful message lay in the simple truth it represented, that when hearts listen deeply enough, they find ways to speak across any silence. The new ranch sign stood proudly at their gate, its fresh paint gleaming in the morning sun. McAllister School of Languages and Horsemanship read the English text, while Chinese characters flowed beneath it. Along the bottom, carved hands illustrated the sign language equivalent, 3 ways of announcing their expanded purpose to the world. 6 weeks after their wedding, Sarah and James's ranch had transformed. The old storage barn had become a classroom, its windows enlarged to let in the clear Wyoming light so essential for signing. Tables salvaged from the church basement lined one wall, while the other displayed teaching charts showing English, Chinese, and sign language side by side. Their first official class gathered beneath the sign, a mix of eager children, curious adults, and 3 deaf students who'd traveled from as far as Cheyenne. Nancy, now their official teaching assistant, helped organize the newcomers while Sarah prepared the morning's lessons. "We're going to need a bigger classroom soon," James signed as he watched another wagon approach. "Words spreading faster than we expected." Sarah nodded, adding a note to their growing waiting list. The governor's wife had arranged for a newspaper article about their unique school, and inquiries arrived daily. Even Patterson had grudgingly enrolled his youngest daughter after she'd begged to learn with her friends. Inside the classroom, Sarah had arranged their students in mixed groups, fluent signers paired with beginners, Chinese speakers with English speakers, each learning from the others. The walls displayed their students' work. Chinese characters practiced with careful brushstrokes, illustrated sign language stories, and bilingual poems composed by the children. James led the advanced horse training session in the corral, where his methods of gentle guidance and silent communication proved especially effective for nervous horses. Ranchers who'd initially come to learn his horse handling techniques often stayed to join the language classes, discovering that understanding silent communication improved their relationships with both animals and people. "It's like learning to listen with your whole self," one weather-beaten cowboy explained to a visitor. "Changes how you see everything once you start paying attention to what ain't being said out loud." The garden had expanded too, now including dedicated teaching plots, where students learned both cultivation methods and the vocabulary of growing things. Chinese vegetables flourished alongside Western crops, while Sarah taught the traditional meanings behind each plant's name. Mrs. Patterson, now one of their most dedicated herbalism students, worked with Sarah to create a reference book combining Western and Chinese medical traditions. "Think how many more people we could help," she'd said, "if we learned to use all the wisdom available to us." Thunder, older now but still majestic, had become a favorite among their younger students. He seemed to understand his role in their growing community, standing patiently as children learned to sign their first words to him, responding to their silent commands with gentle dignity. A letter arrived from the territorial governor's office requesting their guidance in establishing similar programs in other towns. Sarah read it aloud in sign language during the community dinner they hosted every Sunday, where their table had grown to accommodate not just students, but their families as well. "You've created something remarkable here," Thomas signed from his place at the table. He'd settled in Laramie permanently, his own signing now fluid and natural. "This is what Father always wanted for the ranch, a place that brings people together." As the evening wrapped up, Nancy led the younger children in a song they'd created, performed simultaneously in 3 languages. Parents who'd once feared their quiet children would never find their voice watched with pride as their little ones expressed themselves confidently in multiple ways. Sarah added the governor's letter to their growing collection of correspondence, each message a testament to the changes rippling outward from their small Wyoming ranch. James came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist as they watched. Their students head home in the setting sun. "Remember when they said you were too quiet?" He signed against her palm. Sarah smiled, turning to face him. "Silence taught us to listen," she signed back. "Now we're teaching others to hear with their hearts." The letters to the marriage agency lay spread across Sarah's desk, each one telling a story of transformation. She'd been writing them for months. Detailed accounts of how silence could speak volumes, how rejection could lead to unexpected joy, how love could build bridges across any divide. 1 year after their wedding, the McAllister Ranch had become more than just a school. It was a beacon for those who needed to find their own way of speaking to the world. Sarah carefully added the latest letter to the stack, this one accompanied by photographs of their thriving community. "Mrs. Sullivan," she wrote in her now confident English, "you once suggested I return to China because America needed a different kind of woman. I'm writing to tell you about a different kind of America we're building here, one where every voice, spoken or unspoken, has value." James appeared in the doorway, his hands full of fresh drawings from their youngest students. These would join the growing collection on their classroom walls, artwork that spoke in multiple languages of hope and belonging. "The new family arrived," he signed, his movements flowing with the ease of long practice. "Their daughter hasn't stopped smiling since she met the other deaf children." Sarah nodded, adding a note about the new arrival to her letter. "Every month, brought more families seeking what they'd created, a place where difference was celebrated rather than merely tolerated. The sound of horses drew them outside, where Thomas was leading a riding lesson. He'd taken over much of the horse training, showing a natural gift for James's methods. Under the autumn sun, students of all ages practiced their signs while learning horsemanship, their hands speaking to both horses and humans with growing confidence. Nancy, now a poised young woman, supervised a group of children in the garden. They were harvesting vegetables for the weekly market, their hands flying in excited conversation that blended signs, Chinese words, and English with unconscious ease. "Remember when they said we'd corrupt their children with our strange ways?" James signed with a smile. Sarah's response was interrupted by Mrs. Patterson hurrying up the path, clutching a telegram. "It's official," she signed and spoke simultaneously. "The governor approved funding for 5 more schools based on your model. They want you both to help train the teachers." The news spread quickly through the ranch. Students gathered around, their hands creating a fluttering celebration of silent joy. Even Patterson, checking on his daughter's riding lesson, allowed himself a small nod of approval. That evening, as the community gathered for their regular shared meal, Sarah watched the scene with quiet pride. Chinese railway workers chatted, with ranchers, their children playing together in a mix of languages. Deaf students taught new signs to eager learners, while Mrs. Henderson and Wei Lin compared recipes using a combination of gestures and laughter. The troubled silence that had once marked Sarah as unwantable had transformed into something profound, a silence that taught others to listen more deeply, to see more clearly, to love more fully. James touched her arm, drawing her attention to Thunder's paddock. The old horse stood at the fence, watching the gathering with gentle eyes. Beside him, a new foal, born during last winter's storms, frolicked with the children who'd learned to speak his language. "Full circle," James signed, reminding her of that first day at the train station when everything changed. Sarah opened her journal one last time that evening, adding a final note to her letters to the marriage agency. 5 times I was rejected for being too quiet, but silence was never my weakness. It was my gift, waiting to be understood. In finding someone who heard my heart's voice, I discovered that love doesn't need words to speak its truth. It needs only the courage to listen differently. She added a postscript in 3 languages, English, Chinese, and Sign, for every quiet heart still waiting to be heard. Remember, sometimes the perfect voice is the one that speaks without sound. Outside their window, the Wyoming stars painted the sky with silent light, while inside, the warmth of their gathered family, born of blood and choice alike, filled the air with a symphony of unspoken love. In the end, they had built something far greater than a marriage or a school. They had created a place where silence could sing, where every voice could find its way to speak, and where love knew no language barriers.